Hello and thank you for watching. The purpose of this video is to clarify the double standards and hypocrisy used by some people in trying to link between Islam and Islamic texts and violence, while they totally ignore the violent passages and texts within their own books. Actually, a biblical scholar by the name of Raymond Schwager, he says that he has found 600 passages of explicit violence in the Hebrew Bible, also known as the Old Testament. He also found 1,000 verses where God's own violent actions of punishment are described. And he found 100 passages where God expressly commands others to kill people, and several stories where God irrationally kills or tries to kill for no apparent reason. Then he says, and I'm quoting word by word, he says, violence is easily the most often mentioned activity in the Hebrew Bible. I mean no offense to anybody by mentioning these facts, but as we all know, the current trend in the media and in politics is to link between Islam and Islamic texts and violence. And just to show that this is not the fact, and that any passages or texts or verses in Islamic texts, Quran or the sayings of the Prophet, any texts or verses that may have any reference to violence, they are all in the context of defense against attackers and assailants. They are all in self-defense, and we can prove that. And I challenge anyone to bring up and to point out any Islamic text that calls for the killing or attack upon innocent people or aggression against innocent people. You will not find a single text. You will not find a single text that calls for genocide or killing of elderly or women or children. While you will find many texts, as I mentioned in my previous videos, in the Bible, especially the Old Testament, which have these kind of references. For instance, and I will just give a few examples. I just quoted to you what this biblical scholar Raymond Schwager has said. And just to prove that what he said is not really an exaggeration, let me quote to you from Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 1 and 2. This is a commandment from God to his people, to his followers. He says to them, when the Lord your God brings you into the land you are entering to possess, and drives out before you many nations, then you must destroy them totally. Make no treaty with them, and show no mercy. Actually, these are commandments given by God to the Israelites, to his followers. After they fled Egypt, they were rescued by God from the oppression of the Egyptians. But instead of commanding them to be thankful to God for being rescued and taken out of oppression, the commandment given to them is to oppress other nations and to usurp their land, take away their land, to kill them and annihilate them completely, devastate them. And the verses explicitly tell God's people and followers, as we will see, to kill not only the combatants, but to kill the men, the elders, the women, the children, and even the cattle and animal and livestock are to be killed. Even children are to be dashed against rocks. Even children in mothers' wombs are to be ripped out. This is all in the Bible. I'm not quoting anything that is strange. And I will only mention a few quotes in this short video, but you can go back to an internet reference by the title of Skeptics Annotated Bible, where you will find many of these verses. Another quotation from the Bible in Deuteronomy 20, verse 16. God commands his people, his followers, his chosen people, and he says to them, do not leave alive anything that breathes, Do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them, as the Lord your God has commanded you. This is in Deuteronomy 20, verse 16. Now, the problem with this is that we have to know that when people read sacred texts that condone violence, people themselves become internally violent as well. This was pointed out by an American philosopher who was also a revolutionary, and he had written certain pamphlets that ignited and inspired the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence from the British in the 1700s. His name is Thomas Paine. He says, talking about the Bible, he says, "It is a history of wickedness that has served to corrupt and brutalize mankind. And for my part," he says, "I sincerely detest it as I detest everything that is cruel." He points out that cruelty within the Bible incites cruelty and aggression in the people who read these texts. Not only in the Bible, but cruelty and violence and aggression and genocide mentioned in any sacred texts would basically change people and make violence more acceptable to them. Another historian by the name of Joseph Maccabi, he wrote in his treatise a book called The History of Torture. He illustrates the reasoning process behind torture. He says that during the Middle Ages, there was more torture used in Christian Europe than in any other society in history. And he actually attributes this to cruelty and violence and aggression that is within the Bible that people were reading. Going back to Thomas Paine, I quote another saying of his. He says, "The belief in a cruel God makes a cruel man." And the reason behind that is that if people believe that God, who is loving and compassionate, has approved brutal and cruel acts against the innocent, then people would not have, the followers of God, this God, would not have too much guilt and qualms about behaving similarly. Actually, this matter of influence by scriptures, violent scriptures and cruel and harsh passages in scriptures that condone violence against the innocent would affect people psychologically in a negative way, has been proven medically, in medical research as well. I will quote to you a study by Bushman in the Journal of Psychological Sciences, published in 2007. In his study, he says the results suggest, he conducted a study where he noticed and observed the behavior of people who are basically religious people after reading violent passages in their holy texts. And basically he studied the influence of those violent verses in the Bible specifically. He came out with the conclusion. He says these results suggest that the scriptural violence sanctioned by God can increase aggression, especially in believers. Again, I will repeat his conclusion from his medical scientific study. He says that scriptural violence sanctioned by God can increase aggression, especially in believers. And he was not the only scientist to come up with this conclusion. Another scientist by the name of Ledford, he published this article in the Journal of Nature in 2007. This article is by the is titled "Scriptural Violence Can Foster Aggression." I had quoted to you two verses from the Bible, from Deuteronomy 7 and Deuteronomy 20, but there are many others. Just to quote a few more. In Numbers chapter 31, verse 17, again God commands his followers, his people, to attack the Midianites, and he says to them, and this is definitely clear genocide that is sanctioned by God in the Bible. He says to them, kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman that has known a man by lying with him. Meaning a woman that has been married before, they should kill her, and they should kill even the children, the little ones. But all the women, children that have not known a man by lying with them, keep alive for yourself, taking them as slaves as well. So here, this passage or verse condones genocide and slavery, and of course rape as well, because those women, the virgins, are to be taken for themselves, for their own pleasure. Also, in I think I've quoted to you Deuteronomy 20 already. Yes. Another one, Exodus. In Exodus 29, God actually kills the firstborn child of every Egyptian as a punishment, because the Egyptian king would not allow the Israelites their freedom. So God here basically punishes every Egyptian, whether he had a hand and participated in this aggression against the Israelites or not. Every firstborn child was to be killed. In Ezekiel chapter 9, verses 4 to 7, there's another harrowing account where the Lord says, go through the midst of Jerusalem and set a mark upon the foreheads of the men that sigh and that cry for all the abominations that be done in the midst thereof. So the people who did not approve of the abominations committed, they should be marked on their forehead. But what would happen to the others? He says here, and to the others he said in mine hearing, go after him through the city and smite. Let not your eye spare, neither have pity. Slay utterly old and young, both maids and little children and women, but come not near any man upon whom is the mark. So the people who did not condone those abominations are to be spared, but everyone else is to be killed, whether a woman, a man, a child, or an elderly. Also in Hosea chapter 13, verse 16, again, this is a punishment by the Lord, where it says, Samaria shall become desolate, for she has rebelled against her God. They shall fall by the sword. Their infants shall be dashed in pieces. So here he commands his people to do this to the people of Samaria, to basically kill the infants, to dash them in pieces, to pieces. And their women with child shall be ripped up. Imagine pregnant women, their bellies should be ripped up, and the children should be taken out. Quite horrific account of genocide and cruelty and massacre. Going back to the effects this might have had on effects that these teachings might have had on people. Some people argue that many of the violent acts and torture that has taken place throughout the history of Christianity, even against the Jews, the genocides committed against the Jews might have been inspired by such violent passages. Historical examples of violence in the Christian world include, but are not limited to, of course, the Inquisitions, the Crusades, the burning of witches, the religious wars, even amongst the different Christian sects, the religious wars that lasted for decades in Europe, the genocide and pogroms against the Jews, the persecutions of homosexuals, the forceful conversions of the heathens, slavery, the brutal treatment of the mentally ill, suppression of scientists, mutilations, and violent executions of persons convicted with crimes. Some philosophers and scientists and historians argue that such atrocities could have been inspired by such passages in the Bible. And I will conclude my talk with a reference to a book by Steve Wells. It's called Drunk with Blood. Drunk with Blood, if you can see the book. This title of the book was taken from a verse in the Bible as well, Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 39 to 42, in which God himself says, I kill, I wound, I will make my arrows drunk with blood, and my sword shall devour flesh. So this violent theme is found throughout the Bible, and I quoted to you at the beginning of my talk what the biblical scholar Schwager, the number of violent passages he has counted in the Bible. This book, Drunk with Blood, has many other quotes from the Bible that you might have not heard of. And I'll just mention a few examples that are in the book, but you can go back to the book, in which God forced friends and family to kill each other for dancing naked around Aaron's golden calf. Also, God in the Bible burned Aaron's sons to death for offering him strange fire. So there was an offering that God did not accept, so he burned Aaron's sons. God burned complainers to death. He forced the survivors to eat quail until it literally came out of their noses. He sent fiery serpents to bite people for complaining about the lack of food and water, and he killed 14,700 for complaining about his killings. So he killed another 14,700 for complaining about his killings. Very cruel and very harsh and shocking and appalling. Also in the Bible, and these are all quotes from the Bible, you will find in this book, where it shows that God buried alive those that opposed Moses along with their families. So innocent people being killed, and this is quite clear and quite prevalent and pervasive throughout the Old Testament. Also, you will find verses quoted in that book where it shows that in the Bible it said that God burned 250 men to death for burning incense. For burning incense, their punishment was to be burned to death, 250 men. He rewarded Phinehas for throwing a spear through the bellies of a mixed faith couple while they were having sex. Also, he ordered or assisted or approved of dozens of complete genocides, as I mentioned a few of them to you. God also in the Bible accepted human sacrifice in the cases of Jephthah's daughter and Saul's 7 sons. God also in the Bible helped Samson murder 30 men for their clothes and slaughter 1,000 with the jawbone of an ass, and kill 3,000 civilians in a suicide terrorist attack. You can go back to the book and see those quotations from the Bible. Also, God in the Bible killed a man for trying to keep the Ark of the Covenant from falling. He tripped, but he tripped and he couldn't keep it from falling, so he was punished by death. And then 50,070 men were punished by death for looking into the ark. So disproportionate and cruel punishments are quite prevalent and pervasive throughout the Bible, as I mentioned. Also, God approved that David bought his first wife with 200 foreskins from the Philistines, the people who lived in Palestine. Also, God killed King Saul for not killing every Amalekite as he told him to do so. So this was a genocide ordered by God, that King Saul should kill every Amalekite and not spare anybody. But because he spared some people, his punishment was to be killed himself. Also, God slowly killed a baby to punish King David for committing adultery, and the baby is totally innocent. Also, in the Bible, you will find that God killed 70,000 because David had a census that he or Satan told him to do. And so on. Also, God killed 450 religious leaders who lost a prayer contest with Elijah. God also in the Bible killed 27,000 Syrians by having a wall fall on them, and sent an angel to kill 185,000 sleeping soldiers. Basically, if you count all the people killed in the Bible, there's a number, and this number is basically 2,476,633 people. These are the numbers. This is not an estimate. These are the numbers killed by God in the Old Testament. And some people estimate, and this is actually the actual number, if you add up all these numbers I quoted to you, but some people estimate that it is much higher. It is closer to 24 million if you actually figure out the actual numbers. And again, I'm sorry if these quotations may offend anybody, but again, this is not my intention. My intention is not to offend anybody, but my intention is to state the facts and to clarify the double standards used by people who try to link Islamic texts, the Quran, with violence, while they give a total blind eye to such texts in their own books. And I challenge them to bring any similar texts as the ones I just quoted from the Bible, to bring out any similar texts from the Quran that show any condoning or ordering or commandment for any kind of genocide or killing of the innocent. I challenge and I state and affirm very confidently that any text in the Quran that has any kind of violence contained within it, it is in the context of self-defense against attackers and assailants. And never there's any commandment for any mutilation or any killing or harming of the innocent or the elderly or a woman or a child. Thank you for watching.